What if I told you that one of the most powerful ways to improve insulin resistance, activate fat burning, and train your metabolism didn't involve cutting calories at all? It's not keto, it's not even traditional fasting, it's not caloric restriction, and it doesn't require you to take a bunch of supplements or even change your exercise regimen. I call it metabolic microfasts. It's short 6 to 8 hour gaps during your waking hours, not your sleeping period. It's during the day. And it acts as these little metabolic fasts that do monumental things inside your body. The scientific literature is starting to show that these metabolic microfasts sort of flip these metabolic switches back and forth within your body that can make lasting changes on your metabolism. The thing is, a lot of times these switches get turned off with normal eating patterns. So what exactly is a metabolic microfast? How do we do it? And how can it retrain our metabolism? The most important thing to note about these metabolic microfasts is that they are short 6 to 8 hour periods of fasting that are done throughout the day. Remember, when you are fasting, doing a traditional type of fasting method, like maybe 16-8 or something like that, the majority of your fast is when you're sleeping, which is great, that's fine, but the reality is that you're not that metabolically active, you're not moving around, you're not doing things that really burn fat other than sleeping. So you're not eating, that's great. But this is more about capitalizing on the period of time that you're awake and almost like having breakfast and then sort of skipping lunch as an example. Whenever you're fasting or doing any kind of caloric restriction or anything, I do think that micronutrition is super important. So I put a link down below for a company called Phi Health. This is a really cool innovation in multivitamin science. So it has these micro beads. It's like these little almost pods, right? So you have this little container that you swish down with some water, and you can see the multicolored beads. These are different vitamins that have different time releases to them. So they have a morning stack and an evening stack. So it makes it so that you're taking the right, essentially, vitamins at the right time of day. For example, you don't want to take calcium and magnesium together. They cancel each other out. So you'd want to take them in separate stacks. And you also have different vitamins that absorb at different rates of time. Like you want vitamin D, you want all these to like absorb at different periods of time. So Phi Health has put their money where their mouth is and created a technology that allows that to happen. So you're having multiple different time release based on the vitamins that's in it. So it's the most powerful multivitamin system that I've ever seen. So that link down below gets you a special discount for Phi Health. I highly recommend you check them out, especially if you're focusing on metabolic health. So this is different from intermittent fasting. This is not the same as like a structured, strict fasting protocol. What's nice about this is it's entirely flexible. In fact, when I was in Europe just recently, I was doing this inadvertently and it worked out really well. Let me give you an example. When I was in Europe, breakfasts are a thing. And I normally don't eat big breakfasts, but what was happening here is I would eat a big breakfast, bigger. Okay, I'd work out in the morning, fasted, I'd go eat a breakfast, and then I'd be walking around throughout the day. You know, maybe I was eating breakfast a little later than usual, and I'd be just going and blowing, taking the trains, walking around with the family. Next thing I know, it's 3 o'clock, and I'm like, I don't really want to have lunch right now. It's going to disrupt dinner. I want to enjoy a good dinner. So we just push it till 5. Next thing I know, I'm like, I'm able to actually eat a bigger dinner, possibly have a bigger breakfast, enjoy my food more, but I only had 2 meals a day and I had this metabolic microfast in between. And I'll tell you, it was hard for me to keep weight on. Like I was getting almost too lean where I had to increase my calories. And that's a legitimate fact because I was walking so much too. You see, modern life has us constantly grazing, and constant grazing means constant insulin, right? So constant insulin being an absorptive storage hormone, not exactly what you want to have constantly elevated. When you just have this periodic spacing, it lets insulin reset. Now, we talk about this in the case of longer term fasts where you're like crushing insulin levels really low, or keto where you're crushing insulin levels really low. This is more about establishing a new insulin baseline. Think of a fast, like a big fast, as like a big flipping the switch. Think of this micro fast as like a little flipping back and forth, teaching the body to be more metabolically flexible. But why would timing without restricting calories improve insulin resistance? Aren't we always told that we have to just reduce calories to improve weight loss and ultimately insulin resistance? Not necessarily, and the literature is starting to support both sides, really. So what we have to look at is that every time we eat, we have a little insulin bump, right? A little bump. But each time you bump, you have to come back to baseline and you have to resensitize. So you have breakfast, you bump. Snack, you bump. One grape off your kid's plate, you bump again, right? So it's about abstaining from these little bumps so that you recalibrate. It's not just about bringing insulin low. That's one part of the equation. It's about the recalibration. When you have these larger gaps, insulin baseline is restored, and you get this resensitization, which makes everything just function a little bit better. There was a study that was published in the journal Cell Metabolism that took a look at a 6-hour eating period with what's called time-restricted feeding. And this was quite interesting. They found straightforward that when calories were matched, all they had to do is change the eating periods, and they had reductions in insulin resistance, they had improvements in beta cell function, they had, of course, weight loss, but then they had appetite reduction that was independent of the weight loss too. So people actually had less overall appetite. Why? Because their insulin levels weren't haywire and all over the place. They were stabilizing, allowing them to be in tune with their hunger cues a little bit more. How nice would it be to be able to actually feel like you're in control of your hunger, not the other way around? So does eating more often end up backfiring when it comes down to insulin resistance, even if you're eating healthy food? Well, this is called the meal frequency effect, and it's pretty darn crucial. Okay, there was an interesting study that looked at this. This study was really interesting. They looked at 3 square meals a day compared to 6 square meals a day, virtually same amount of calories. So same amount of energy. They even managed their energy output, their physical activity. So they was really controlled. What they found is that the 6 meals per day definitely triggered a chronically high level of insulin. I shouldn't say super high, but higher than the 3-meal group. They had sustained levels of glucose that remained very high throughout the day. And when you look at chronic disease, when you look at chronic metabolic issues, chronic insulin resistance, they are all characterized by chronically high levels of circulating insulin. Now, if you are metabolically healthy, this might not be as big of an issue. Here's the kicker though. Over 90% of people in the United States are dealing with some degree of metabolic dysfunction. So unless you're part of the 10% of people that are squeaky metabolically healthy, you probably should be paying attention to chronically high levels of circulating insulin. More meals does not mean more stable. It means more metabolic stress. But here's the plot twist. There's something that's called the second meal effect. So there's a study in diabetes care that was interesting, and it found that if people had like a little yogurt before their meal, it was actually making glucose a little more stable, right? This is called the second meal effect. Now, the reason that it's doing this is because it's priming the system with some insulin ahead of time, so by the time the next meal comes along, the body is ready and prepared by keeping insulin high. So let me ask you this. Do you want your body to always be ready and prepared for food? That's the question we have to ask ourselves. These are tools that you can use by doing that second meal effect. But do we really want that all the time? Do we want to have a quote second meal effect, third meal effect, fourth meal effect, fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth, ninth, 10th because we're grazing all day? So in theory, it's like, oh, I could keep my glucose stable by keeping my insulin high all the time. It's like a diabetic person using insulin all day to keep their glucose flatlined. That's not necessarily what we want just because we can do it. So what makes this work? Well, it all comes down to AMPK. This is the metabolic sort of switch or regulator within our body. When AMPK is activated, our body knows that it's time to burn fat. It knows that it's time to increase glucose uptake, right? So that we can have fuel. It happens when we are in a deficit or a period of time without food. There was a study that was published in the journal Biology and Chemistry that found just this, found that when there was glucose starvation, independent of caloric restriction, and also independent of insulin, that things would sort of stabilize and it would increase AMPK. So essentially we know that when we go periods without glucose or periods without food, AMPK increases and all the metabolic benefits of that increase. Fat oxidation, glucose utilization, less overall fat buildup within the cells. It's everything that we want, right? It is the hallmark of quote unquote caloric restriction, but you don't really have to be calorically restricting day to day to have AMPK increase, right? It's the same thing. Exercise increases AMPK. Maybe you're in a deficit at that very second, but you're not in a literal deficit over the course of the day, right? We always have these undulations of when we are in an AMPK phosphorylated state or not. So the goal with these metabolic microfasts is to allow AMPK to turn on and off, and teach our body to be more flexible with it. There was a review and it looked at grazing and this mixed fuel effect. So essentially, when you are grazing all the time or you have constant influx of different nutrients and signaling, what it does to the body. The biggest thing they noticed with this was an increase in oxidative stress and mitochondrial stress. Okay, it's not just about carbs, fats, and protein. It's about how are we affecting the metabolic system and how are we stressing that system. So more grazing and more mixed fuels like proteins, fats, and carbs combined, and all kind of what they call mixed nutrient overload would actually impact how our mitochondria were stressed. More stressed mitochondria will long-term affect our metabolism. These metabolic microfasts are like real-time switch flips. So think of fasting again as this big switch that you flip. Think of metabolic microfasts as little switches that teach your body to toggle back and forth. We want our bodies to become resilient. If all we do is longer fasts and then longer periods of eating, we only learn to pull the big levers, not the smaller levers that help us toggle back and forth throughout the day. Personally, I want my body to be incredibly resilient at switching back and forth to fats and carbs, not just become a one-trick pony where I'm really good at fasting or really good at not. So to put this into an actionable format, what should you do? Let's say 6 to 8 hours of metabolic microfasts 2 to 3 times per week. That's all it takes. Okay, you could add this on with a regular fasting protocol on other days, but really, if you're just trying to marginally improve your metabolic health, or even monumentally improve it with a little bit of work, just taking these breaks where you skip lunch or skip snacks and go 6 to 8 hours 2 times per week. Maybe do one on Tuesday, one on Thursday. All you really have to do is either skip your snacks or possibly even delay a meal. Like if you wanted to say, I'm gonna have an early breakfast and a late lunch, but still have dinner, that would work too. We're not talking about removing a meal. We're not talking about intermittent fasting where we're just maybe removing breakfast and everything else stays the same. We're talking about eating the same amount of calories, but just shuffling so you have space and time between your meals. Remember, the goal here is to restabilize and reset insulin levels so that you resensitize that everything works better. Now, what happens when you start stacking these metabolic microfasts with things like exercise or maybe even a sauna? That's where it gets interesting.